Okay, we're going to get started for our 3 p.m. session. I'm John Tankard with the Tulsa Planning Office. Thank everybody for attending today. I'm going to introduce our next session, but first, if you have questions for our speaker, please submit them in the Q&A, and we will read those aloud after the presentation. This session will describe infrastructure options to improve user safety, outline a planning process that promotes inclusion, and detail techniques for outreach that can lead to better streets for all people. This session is presented by the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust, or TSET. Our speaker for this session is Dave Roberts, the Senior Vice President of Planning and Business Development at Craft and Toll, where he collaborates on planning and urban design projects like the Tulsa Regional GO Plan, completed in 2015, as well as numerous citywide master plans, greenway studies, and corridor plans for communities across the Mid-South region. Dave, whenever you're ready.
All right, good. Well, I'm excited to be here. I love these kind of presentations because I feel like a pastor that's preaching to the choir. I think most people on this Zoom meeting are either planners or MPO staff or municipal staff, and it's good to remind ourselves why we do what we do. Why is accessibility, inclusion, and equity? Why does it matter? I mean, why should we try to move the needle? And so a lot of this is going to be stuff that you probably know. Maybe you know it intuitively, and things that hopefully you're going to agree with. And so I'll show a few case studies too. And just know that I'm coming to you by way of Little Rock, Arkansas, where I live. We do work in my firm. We do work in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. And as John mentioned, I worked on the GO plan years ago in Tulsa. So let's just get started and talk about streets for people. And I love to start with this quote from Fred Kent. When you design your city around cars, you get more cars. When you design your city around people, you get more people. And that really should be our goal. You know, we don't want what we see here on the screen. This isn't what we desire to live in and around. What we want are streets that are safe, right? We want streets that promote that quality of life, that live, work, play. And the reason I love this graphic, and I borrowed this from Tool Design Group, who we work with quite often, and that is that it's not just the vehicles or even just the bikes that are on that road. That's the mobile part of it. The static part is just as important, and that's what's happening along the streets, behind the sidewalks. It's the schools, it's the playgrounds, it's the parks, it's the houses, the neighborhoods, and those are the parts that are vulnerable. And so instead of just looking at our streets for the vehicles, we really need to be thinking about how we can accommodate all users. If you look at this image on the right, that is anywhere in rural Arkansas, anywhere probably in rural Oklahoma, and a lot of our states in this region. And now imagine if you are pushing a stroller to that bus stop. Imagine if you're in a wheelchair trying to get to that bus stop, as opposed to the commitment that was made in the community on the left, which is a complete street. And that obviously is more desirable. A lot of times it's a funding issue. It's an education issue too. Some of you in the Tulsa area probably recognize this. This is downtown Broken Arrow. I worked with Broken Arrow on a sidewalk study and a drainage study many years ago. I can't claim the design of this. I think it was Hal Van Kuren that did this redesign. And I know there was a master plan done too. But what I love about this is the before. So this is what Broken Arrow used to look like, if some of you remember. It had a fairly wide street. They had big boxes right on the interstate. Most people weren't coming down here to shop. If they did, they parked right in front of the door, went in, got their flowers or got their haircut or whatever it was, and left. And really the downtown core was starting to decline dramatically. And they realized here in this instance that they needed to improve that pedestrian zone and maybe even add that amenity zone. So this is what they ended up with. This is in the same location as that previous photo, and you can see the different aspects of this downtown, and it is booming. They have people living nearby above some of these shops and restaurants, and it just took just this public improvement to get the private sector going, and things really turned around. So again, it's all about the pedestrians and safety and providing them space, and the merchants can kind of set their wares out on the sidewalk, and people can flow between. And you got that amenity zone where people can sit and relax. They rebranded it the Rose District, and kudos to them. And I show this to a lot of small towns I work in Arkansas. I do a lot of work in towns under 20,000, and say, you know what, this won't happen overnight, but you really have to look at your infrastructure and figure out how you can move that needle. And it's about the pedestrian. And the upper right is in the same location in the Rose District in Broken Arrow, and that's the rapid flashing beacon to stop the motorists at a mid-block crossing to make sure it's safe for them to come across. You can see the two little bollards there. You break the plane on those bollards, and it activates that crossing. And of course, we all probably know what hawk signals are and the importance of this. But again, it's about the importance of our streets and who should be the primary users, and that would be the ones who are most vulnerable. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but these curb extensions are really important. I like to see more of these even in the smaller towns because it reduces that distance those pedestrians have to cross. If you look in the upper left, they'd be crossing almost twice as much if those weren't in place. And so it provides that safer element for them to traverse that intersection. And of course, you need to have adequate crosswalks to signify to the pedestrian or the drivers that the pedestrians are going to cross. But let's talk a little bit about active mobility and bike lanes. We all see bike lanes popping up in our towns, even sharrows, which may not be the safest option, but when we're going to do a bike lane, we like to have that protected, like you see on the right there. At least at a minimum, have some paint, have those vertical delineations if we can, or in the bottom left, you've got a bike box that allows that cyclist to come past the vehicle, get into that box, so that if they're going to either go straight or turn, they don't have to try to read the mind of the motorist that might be turning right into them. And so we're seeing more and more of this in the Mid-South, which is important for all street users. And what we have to remember is that we have a lot of different comfort levels. We've got anywhere from on the far right, which people refer to as the spandex crowd, which I'm a proud member of, all the way down to the left, which might be your child or grandchild. And what is their comfort level and their confidence as far as dealing with the motorists and other obstacles? It could even be folks walking a dog with a long leash. It could be a lot of other children and that speed level, but that comfort is real important. I love what Tulsa has on their river trail. I've ridden it many, many times, and it's just nice to have that separation of uses where you have the pedestrians obviously with their own space, and you'll see the joggers and the skateboarders on that side, the strollers as well. And then on the right side, you have the biking folks that are going in two different directions, really at their own pace. And this is sort of a goal that we're looking for in Central Arkansas for the river trail, which right now is just one 12-foot path as we're looking to master plan and make some changes. So that separation of uses is really important. And of course, those uses, you start thinking about your street, and that's, the complete street I mentioned before. And I love the fact that AARP endorses that. When you think about their clients, their members, they're all seniors, and they want to have that safe space, whether they're on a sidewalk or even if they're in their bike lane. And so you separate those uses to allow for that to be designed appropriately for the different speeds of the active mobility and the motorists, as well as transit users. And I'm going to talk about universal design next, because it's really important to me. And accessibility was in the title. It's you'll see why here in a minute. It kind of hits home for me. But universal design is design that allows all people, regardless of age, size, and ability or disability, to use a space. And if you look at that graphic in the middle there, we're not just talking about wheelchairs. We're talking about millions of people. This is in America, 57 million, about 19% of the population. Of course, it ranges from physical disabilities of climbing stairs, hearing, sight, or completely blind. And when you think about designing for the folks that need those special conditions, you're really designing for everybody. That's why it's called universal. That's what's so amazing about it, is if you do it properly, everyone benefits. There's so many small towns that have had things just the way they've always been, and they have barriers throughout their town, and it certainly doesn't meet the needs of all people. So this is why it's important to me. This is my daughter. Her name is Alex. She was born with cerebral palsy. She's 20 years old now, but has been mainstreamed in school and lives a very full life. But as you can see on the left, she operates a power wheelchair to navigate through her world. And she's quite spoiled. We've taken her to Disney World 6 times. I mean, we travel a lot with her. And everywhere I go, I'm always analyzing what I see, and just realizing in most cases, those barriers don't need to be there. And they're either left over from a previous generation, or there's something that was just poorly designed, whether it was curb cuts at a crosswalk that don't even line up, whether it's just improper accessible parking, van parking, you name it. I've seen it all. And so it is important to me personally, because for 20 years I've been living this. Of course, as a landscape architect, I was trained to design the right way using universal design methodology, but it's something that we need to remember. And I wanted to show you this image because this is her power chair now, and technology can really do amazing things. Not only can it stand her up, but even seated, it can scissor lift her up to an adult's eye level height. And so technology is great, right? It can really improve the quality of life for folks like my daughter, Alex. But if the built environment has barriers, until we get to the level of the hovercraft, like, something in Star Wars that Jabba the Hutt has his little hover, we're still going to have those barriers to overcome, because in the reality, we've got wheels. And again, whether they're strollers, bikes, wheelchairs, we just have to make sure we reduce those barriers. And so one of the things that I really enjoy doing, and I'm doing a lot of it these days, are what we call walk audits or walk shops. And this is a photo from way back in 2015 when we worked on the Go plan, or a couple photos. But what I always do when I talk to the residents or the city officials, in a lot of towns it's the mayor, the public works director, is I tell them, if my daughter was with us, she couldn't go from here to there. She couldn't get off the bus where that bench is in the way, there on the left, even if the bus has a wheelchair lift. She couldn't do well navigating along this busy road with the sidewalk that's in disrepair, and especially if it's right on the edge where you don't have much of a buffer. And so, like I said, I've been doing a lot of this lately. I tend to do it more in the smaller towns, under 20,000, sometimes under 10,000 population. A couple that I did last year, and again, it's just getting with the leaders and just showing them, hey, here's some low hanging fruit. And this is important because this is the safety of your residents. If you want to get visitors to come to your town and potentially spend money in your downtown, eat at your restaurant, if you want to, generate some economic development, you have to think about all users. And I love it, like in the bottom left, where I get someone who joins us who's in a wheelchair. He was in a power scooter, but it shows the group that sometimes that individual has to take a different route just to follow the way we're walking down a sidewalk, crossing a street, and the way we're navigating. And so what I find is that, like I said, I think before, the mayors or the city manager, a lot of times they'll say, wow, I've grown up here my whole life. I've never noticed that power pole in the middle of the sidewalk, or I've never noticed, that barrier that you just pointed out. And so I think it's important to do these walk audits. I'm doing 8 of them. I usually only do 2 in the spring and 2 in the fall. I'm doing 8 of them this spring and early summer. So then basically from last month till 2 months from now. And with those come a technical report that really reminds them of the things that we looked at, some recommendations, and even ways to find funding, grant funding to overcome some of their issues with barriers. But I want to talk about inclusion too, because accessibility is important. Inclusion is super important, because when you think about my world and my daughter, her ability to be included in activities, whether it was through school or using Miracle League or a choir or church or whatever it is, inclusion is huge. And I love that quote from Melfi that says, you have a responsibility to make inclusion a daily thought so we can get rid of the word inclusion, right? Why should we have to make it a special consideration? It should be automatic. And the graphic you're looking at is when we do planning projects here in my firm, this is what we like to show our clients. We like to say, we want to get input from, it should say the community. It says client input. We want to get technical data brought in, all the economics and the demographics. And then we're going to start the design and planning process. But we're going to keep circling back to that technical data, and especially back to the users, the client, the community, before we go back up again and refine our drawings. And inclusion, I want to give you a case study of what worked pretty well for us in Siloam Springs. Siloam Springs is a town of 17,000 people in Northwest Arkansas, right kind of on the edge of the border between Oklahoma and Arkansas, just due east of Tulsa. And they asked us to look at their Main Street. And their Main Street has a kind of an industrial section before it gets into their downtown. And so this is our process for our public engagement. We did a opening meeting, and then our team stayed at a church that whole week and did an on-ground workshop, and then conducted all these other aspects. We did 3 walk audits. We met with property owners along the corridor. We did a number of open houses for stakeholder groups that were identified by the Main Street director as well as City Hall. And then we did a closing meeting. We had pretty good participation. And it was important to get out to talk to the people, to show the people. But even when you do the opening meeting, the diversity of the crowd is maybe not what it needs to be. People are curious to see what you're doing, but not everyone comes out. But we made sure we had a translator there, and all of our boards and information were bilingual because Main Street passes through a middle section. I'll show you here. That was our corridor from coming into their downtown area. If you can see my cursor, this was the downtown. And this whole middle section here is predominantly Hispanic and lower income. And a lot of businesses where people walk from these neighborhoods surrounding it to these smaller shops. And so we divided it into some logical zones, kind of that entry gateway that we had to deal with, the railroad underpass. On the left, the zone 1 was the downtown, sort of the destination. But that middle zone 2 was really where we wanted to hear from folks of what they wanted to see happen. And so we did multiple walk shops in a few day period. You can see our signs are even bilingual, just to let everyone know up and down that street what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think the bottom left, that photo is the city leaders. And we've got city council, city manager, mayor. And you know what? Most of them probably have not spent much time walking on this particular street. And so the things I showed them and what we talked about with regard to drainage and barriers and the issues with grade changes and lack of pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, some of it was kind of new to them, even though this is the town that they represent. And so it was real important to get them out there and just walk that built environment. And then we did other groups, including shop owners and residences that were in this particular spot, so they could sort of hear and see what was happening. And then we put together boards, like I mentioned, that were bilingual to allow them to help us steer the direction of this corridor plan with regards to some potential cross sections. What's your appetite for having bike lanes, or does it need to be a multi-use path, or how are we going to approach the crosswalks and the crossings? Until we ultimately had our solutions on, and then we presented this, as I mentioned, to the public. And so I felt like it was pretty successful. The city is still in the next steps of implementation, and we're actually going to circle back around and, of all things, have to kind of revisit the roundabout issue. But I think it's got some good momentum, and I think we're going to keep that going and hope to see a lot of these changes fall into place. But it was all about inclusion and making sure all the voices were heard, no matter what language was spoken, so that we could get that information. So I want to talk about equity as well. Equity, why is it important to planners? So when you think about a community, the livability of a community and how well everyone is connected, and what the confidence is of people in that community to speak up and feel like they're being heard, that's what equity is. That productivity, if they're fairly treated, whether it's socially or economically, and that's a hard thing, and it's really a hard subject to have. But what I really like is this graphic that came from the Robert Johnson Woods Foundation, and that is the difference between equity and equality is that equality, everyone gets the same thing, but equity, everyone gets the things they deserve. So look at the top, that's equality. When you hear the word equality, you're thinking, oh, that's perfect, that's what we need, right? Not necessarily. There's my daughter in her wheelchair. You just gave her a bike that she can't use, or your granddaughter on the far top right, she can't even fit on that bike. So yeah, everyone got the same thing, but it doesn't really work for them versus equity, where we get what we deserve, what we need, what we can use. And that's what we have to think about with our communities with regards to, their access to healthy foods and transportation and children getting to school. And it just we need to really strive for that equity. So according to HUD, the average working American spends about 60% of their budget on housing and transportation. So let that sink in. 60% of your budget. Think about your car payment, or if you're in a family with teenagers or young adults, you might have 3 cars or 4 cars. Think about your mortgage or your rent, and then think about what you bring home each month. That's a lot of money. 60% of your budget. So if we think about that equity in transportation, if we and a lot of towns in Arkansas don't have public transit unless they're the bigger cities. And I imagine Oklahoma is the same, unless it's Tulsa, Oklahoma City, or maybe a college town. How are folks going to get to work, and how are the kids going to get to school? And so what about our downtowns? What if they're more of a live, work, play? You've got a lot of mixed use, and you're going to cut down on that transportation. Maybe we're going to start looking at our bike infrastructure so people have those options to reduce that 60%, so that they maybe have other options to go towards their health. So let's look at the health data. This is from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation again. And we'll start on the left. If you look at those US obesity rates, and these just came out, these are the new ones from last month, 2021. Oklahoma, unfortunately, is 4th worst in the nation. You don't want to be number 1 on this list. This is not like, yay, we're number 1. This is where you want to be number 50, which is Colorado. So Oklahoma is just 1 better than Arkansas. So we don't have much to brag about either. So that's not good to have an obesity rate that is like that. And over the years, it just keeps getting worse and worse. And when you think about that, you have to couple that with access to healthy foods. Click one more time here. Housing and transit, diet and exercise, all those health factors in the blue on that right-hand chart. That's what leads to the map I'll show you next. That's that green at the top, which is the length of life and quality of life. And there are other things in here, whether it's education, employment, income, tobacco use, a lot of other factors. But we as planners can really maybe move the needle or make some change when we really start focusing on equity with regards to housing, transit, and access to diet and exercise and healthy food. And so here's the Oklahoma map. And trust me, Arkansas is just as dark. What you don't want to see are the dark green, the 59 to 77. So what they do, Robert Wood Johnson, if you've not seen this, looks at every county in America, and they'll use all of the statistics. They actually have a map for the blue, which is the health factors, and they have a map for the green, which is the outcome. So I just chose to show you the green. But and typically what you'll see is your downtown, although Oklahoma City is not, it's not white, is it? It's right. But anyhow, what you tend to see is your bigger cities tend to be the lighter color, which is a little less obese. You get out into the rural areas in Arkansas, it's along the Mississippi, along the Delta areas. We have bad access to food, bad transportation, really antiquated infrastructure. And so that's where you're going to have people living shorter lives and not feeling healthy during their lives because of all these factors that contribute. So I want to give you another case study. This is a project we did a couple of years ago with Tool Design Group. And it is in El Dorado, Arkansas, which is about 17,000 people also, kind of like Siloam. This is way down south Arkansas as you get close to the Texas line. We actually did their bicycle and pedestrian master plan. And then they asked us to do what they called the Hillsborough Gateway corridor. And it's a 4-mile corridor. And on one end of the corridor, we have a lower income population. And you can see from the photos on the left, top and bottom left, the infrastructure is very, let's say, lacking. It is left over from the 1950s. Even on the top right, which is sort of the middle of the corridor, not great. And then on the bottom right, It's the west end of the corridor, and it's quite different. It's huge setbacks and big car lots and churches, and it's still not adequate. I don't know if you can see, but there's a person trying to walk to work in the grass along the side of the road. And so what they asked us for is to look at improvements to the corridor, because we helped them negotiate ownership to get it off of the Arkansas DOT ownership and to become a city street, because there was a bypass that this no longer functioned as a state highway. It was really working in conjunction with the city network. And so what we heard from some of the city leaders is, oh, the folks down in the low income area, they don't ride bikes. Well, we set up shop for a whole week to have this workshop, and we saw lots of folks on bikes and lots of people walking, even in dangerous areas. So similar formula. We were there for 4 days. And by the way, we set up our studio in the low income areas so that, again, we're talking about equity here. We didn't want those folks to be intimidated to go to City Hall for public meetings, because City Hall means something different to different people. We wanted them to feel comfortable that we're in their neighborhood, come talk to us at any point. And we tried to engage some of the religious leaders in the area. And we had one person who was on our steering committee, well, multiple, but one in particular who seemed to know everyone in that part of town, and he brought them to us so we could get that input. So we had 2 public meetings, one in the front, one in the back. We did a lot of stakeholder meetings. We had pretty good participation for such really a small area. And by the way, we did engage kids. We encouraged them to come and wanted to hear their input. And so just a snapshot, this is our framework plan. The low income is on the right, and that's where we were set up, is way over here for their public meetings and all of our workshop. And then the larger big boxes and whatnot were over here on the left. And then their downtown is right here. And if you know anything about El Dorado, they've poured, I don't remember the number, I mean, 50 million into their downtown for their Murphy Arts District. And so they get a lot of performing artists that come through. They've built an amphitheater, and they've built an indoor venue, and they've revitalized their square. But this is the gateway to and from into their downtown. So they really needed to accommodate folks coming through. But more importantly, they wanted to accommodate the people who live along it. So here's the interesting part. What we heard from the city leaders was, I think we want bike lanes. I think we want bike lanes on this road. We need to add some street trees. We need to make it feel inviting. Let's get some lighting, and that should be right. What we heard from the residents, especially the folks on the east end, was, we're not going to ride in the street. We're not going to use bike lanes. We need safe access to schools. And go back, and we had a public school. We had 2 public schools right in this area. We have a community college that was right here next to this main intersection. And then, of course, we had the downtown district. And so we needed to provide safe access for all users along this corridor. And it really, their input really changed the design of this project, where we ended up with a 5-foot sidewalk on the one side, but a 10-foot multi-use path on the north side, the entire length of the 4-mile corridor. And had this been an RDOT project, they would have said, we're only going to fund 5 feet of that 10-foot multi-use path. But because the city was going to be taking this road over in the negotiations, RDOT was going to build everything that was approved, and then the city would inherit it. So they were going to get their 10-foot multi-use path along with the beautification, although the city had to pay for the landscape and the lighting. But that's still, the construction is going to start soon on this project. So I want to show you a couple images. This is on the east end. In fact, I am standing in front of where we did our workshop. The building right behind me, the parking lot was right behind me. So you can see, again, this is rural America, right? This is typical Southern town, days gone by, there was probably never a sidewalk. There's really just a flow of cars coming off and on the road. So if you're a pedestrian, it's not very safe no matter what side of the road you're on if you're trying to go down the street. And then the after images we were showing folks for this corridor redesign was going to include that 10-foot wide multi-use path for everybody, and to limit those curb cuts and to add some beautification to the corridor. And it carried through all the way through the 4 miles. And so, the important part here, as I'm wrapping up, is, we're so used to that, those two images on the left where it's sprawl, and we just have plenty of land in America. Let's just keep going and just use our cars to get between it, as opposed to maybe the European model that a lot of our towns are starting to come back to. And that is, maybe we would live, work, and play in the same place so that we can enjoy streets for people. It's not just for the vehicles, it's for everybody. So that I want you to think about that. Where do you live? Where do you work? Where do you play? How do you get there? Is it accessible? Is it diverse, inclusive? Is it safe? And so, that's why it matters. It matters because this is our children and our grandchildren that are going to inherit it. We need to make sure it's done well and it's safe for all users.
All right, thank you, Dave. I think we've got time for just one question before our next session. So you talked about getting people to put themselves in other people's experience when they're out on the street, and you referenced your daughter. For folks that have other types of disabilities, say visual impairments or hearing impairments, are there any techniques that you recommend for helping engineers or planners kind of understand that experience better?
Yeah, and you see this when you go to the larger cities. I like to go to the APA national conferences when I can and travel to some of the bigger cities, and you'll see at the crosswalks, you'll see the bird chirp. You'll hear the bird chirping at the crosswalk to signify when it's safe to cross. You also, of course, we all know about the truncated domes that give the visually impaired indicators as they're coming to an edge. And so, yeah, there's a lot of design techniques like that. And you're right, it's not just about a wheelchair. It's easy for me to give that example because that's the world I live in with my daughter. But it's all users, and sound and texture can really help with those, especially with those crossings. And you'll even see those truncated domes in towns that have like subways or rapid transit. Right on the edge of those platforms will be large strips of the bright yellow truncated domes to signify, you're at the edge.
All right. Well, Dave, thank you very much for your presentation and your insights.